Okay, we're in chapter 13 now, so let's get started. This is not one of the happiest chapters in the human sexuality text, but it's one that needs to be covered. Um, I've got a illustration here from 1616. You know, there has been a long and sordid history of rape and sexual abuse and harassment of different kinds across human history. Let's start off today by defining what the word rape and what different kinds of rape really mean. The unlawful compelling of a woman through physical force or duress to have sexual intercourse. Okay, this is a pretty specific definition, and it's the one that the United States government followed prior to 1970. Now you can see why this definition was abandoned for a couple of reasons. But the things that are sticking out to you most prominently, I'm not going to comment on them yet because I wanted to show you sort of how our government and our lawmakers focused and how the term changed over time. So here we have the change, which was an act of sexual intercourse that is forced upon a person. This is the definition that was in place through the 1970s and 80s. Okay, so you can see that the first change was recognizing that you don't have to be a woman to get raped. So we got rid of the of a woman part, but we still include sexual intercourse, and we still leave forced on, and then it has to be a person. Okay. By the 1980s, they simplified this even further and broadened the definition to any kind of non-consensual sex act. Okay, now this is important because now we have a change from it having to be forced. They first off took out duress. Duress is where, even though there may not have been physical harm to the victim, there was psychological harm that led them to believe that physical harm probably was really likely. So they got rid of duress by the 1970s, and they just had the word force. Okay, and it wasn't physical force necessarily, just any kind of force. By the 1980s, they started to realize it doesn't even have to be like overt force. It needs to be anything where consent was not given. And then by the 1980s, they've taken out upon a person, so that they could acknowledge that sometimes the victim is not human. And then they also took out sexual intercourse because that brings to mind coitus, and they really wanted to make sure that they included all kinds of sex acts that could involve any orifice, and it could even involve objects other than a body part being inserted into people's orifices. Today, well, up until 2012, I'm sorry, that's sort of still today in my mind, but okay. Up until 2012, the FBI's definition stayed the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. So you'll see that the FBI kept the old 1970 style definition all the way up until 2012, which really had an impact on the way that the rape statistics were accumulated nationwide. It was actually really surprising to a lot of lawmakers when they found out that this was the definition that the FBI had been working under, and so that lawmakers thought that rape as they defined it was going down, when in fact it might have been that the FBI was counting the rate of rape at using a different definition. So as of 2012, the FBI's definition now is penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. So the FBI took a lot more words to say what basically the general definition is after the 1980s. They're very specific, but encompassing a lot more behaviors now, a lot more victims, and including that aspect of it just not being consensual rather than it having to be under force or duress. Okay, so that's our current definition at this point. Now there are different kinds of rape. The one that most of us, when we think of rape, what pops to our mind is stranger rape, where you don't know the attacker. It could be somebody who jumps out of the bushes or who breaks into your apartment and waits for you or something like that. It could be different kinds of stranger rape, like the blitz sexual assault, where a person rushes the victim and rapes the victim and then flees. And so it was all just one big act and then they left. The home invasion sexual assault is the type where either they break in before the victim has arrived and they're waiting for the victim, or the victim is in their house and the rapist enters the house for the purpose of rape. And then there's the contact sexual assault, where the rapist comes in contact with the victim and it's a very much a crime of opportunity, not necessarily like the blitz or the home invasion where they have all the act was completely intentional and planned. But the thing is, stranger rape happens very rarely. Much more commonly is what we now call acquaintance rape. When I was in school, they had just started to call this a name, date rape. And the assumption was that you were in a romantic situation with somebody, and one person decides that it's going to be a sexual encounter and the other person doesn't want it to be a sexual encounter. Now we realize you don't have to be on a date. It could be anyone who you know. And in fact, this term encompasses date rape, what we used to call date rape, but it also includes what we call marital or spousal or partner rape, and it can also include incest, which is where you're related to the person. So there are different kinds of acquaintance rape: battering, force only, obsessive or sadistic. So these different kinds of rapes would all fall under the general term of acquaintance rape. About 80% of rapes are thought to fall underneath the acquaintance rape umbrella. It's one of the least reported crimes, though, and so it's not really super clear how often it happens. But the statistics kind of lead us to the conclusion that it happens. About 80% of rapes are probably acquaintance rapes. Then there's the statutory rape, where the victim can't give their consent for one reason or another. It could be because of them experiencing diminished capacity. They have an IQ below 80. They're drunk or otherwise chemically altered. And then there's age-based statutory rape. Every state has a statute that delineates at what age a person can give their legal consent to have sex. For many states it's 18, and 18 is the convenient age where you can give consent to all sorts of things, like signing a lease or agreeing to a debt, things like that. Other states, the statutory age is younger. I'm in the state of Washington, and in the state of Washington the statutory age is 16. And then it has in Washington the additional caveat of the partner needs to be within a certain number of months of the person's age. So 16, and then the partner needs to be within 60 months of the 16-year-old's age. Most people follow the policy of it's most like regular lay people who are trying to figure out whether a person can give their statutory consent. The safest thing to assume is that the person needs to be 18 years old to give their consent. Otherwise, you may be violating the statute, and then it's called statutory rape. Now, this final category is a little misleading because it's not its own category in and of itself. It's any of the other categories, but the rape would also include forced sex acts by threat of death or serious bodily injury, forced sex acts involving an unconscious or drugged victim. We just had a case of this that happened in California, and the victim was she had been drinking and was completely unconscious, and so that's called an aggravated rape. And then if the victim is less than 12, it's not just a statutory rape. Now it's an aggravated statutory rape. The forced sex acts with an unconscious victim, if they're unconscious because of drug or alcohol use, it's technically a statutory rape because a person who is altered because of drugs or alcohol can't give their consent, but then it's considered an aggravated rape if they were so drunk or so drugged that they were unconscious. So really, aggravated rape is something that gets tagged on to other kinds of rape. All right, let's get through some rape myths. This first one, the idea that women encourage rape by the way that they dress or by the way that they act, or because they knew that going to the date's apartment was a signal to the date that she intended to have sex, and so now she's changing her mind, or she's pulling the rug out from underneath him, or whatever. Women encourage rape is the idea. The idea is that women need to be taught how not to cause themselves to get raped. That's kind of the idea behind this rape myth. And of course, it shouldn't matter if a woman was passed out naked in front of a stranger or a date or anyone. It should be implicit that she's not giving her consent, right? She should not have to fight off a rapist all the time. Women don't encourage rape with their style of dress. They may be encouraging interest. They might be wanting to attract a particular mate or a particular person for dating, but that doesn't mean that they are trying to attract them for tonight to have sex right now. And that's the thing, is that women do not encourage rape. Rapists take the opportunity to rape, which brings up the issue of why do some men rape? I'm going to say men sometimes by accident when I say rapist, because it's theoretically possible for women to rape men, but virtually every rape case, the perpetrator is male. Rapists lose control over their sexual urges. This falls under the category of myth for a couple of reasons. Rapists, it depends on what kind of rape we're talking about. With acquaintance rape, there may be miscues, and so maybe there was some sexual activity going on, making out, maybe even oral sex, and then it results in a rape after maybe some amount of sexual activity has come on, and then the rapist will say something like, well, you led me on, and I couldn't help myself. Well, that's what rapists say. That's not what regular men say. Regular men say, I'm disappointed, or regular men say, I'm going home and taking a cold shower, or all sorts of things that recognize that their amorous partner has the right to cut off sexual activity at any point. Rapists don't lose control of their sexual urges. Rapists just lose control. And oftentimes the loss of control manifests itself in a sexual act, but the thing that they lost control over is their ability to see their victim as human, their ability to see their victim as a person who has self-determination and the ability to say no when the person wants to. They see the other person as an object. So it's not, and then they also, the worst kind of rapist, if you have the aggravated type, is that they see their victim as deserving of not only just becoming the receptacle for the rapist's passion, if that's what we want to call it. They see the victim as someone who deserves to be put in his or her place, and that's why they're being raped, because the person denied the rapist of what the rapist feels entitled to. And so it's not a sexual urge, it's a power urge, it's a dominance urge. So that's why this is a myth. Yes, the rapists lose control, but it's not over their sexual urges in the way that we usually use that term. How about the idea that women secretly want to be raped? I've left this picture up this whole time because a lot of times men who have these kinds of rape ideologies will look at women dressed like this and say, well, what did they expect? They must want it. In fact, some men believe that when a woman says no, that just means try harder. That's actually a joke that people tell. It just means try harder. Um, some people will point to the contents of women's fantasies. Sometimes women will report sexual fantasies where a stranger finds them so attractive that he just can't help himself. He's so overwhelmed with her beauty and her alluringness that he just can't help himself. Well, that doesn't mean that she wants to be raped. That means that she wants to be perceived as desirable. And, like I mentioned, female fantasies, back when we talked about fantasizing, female fantasies aren't usually super explicit with penises and vaginas and things in their imagery. Female fantasies oftentimes are very tame. There's kissing and hugging, and then yes, we had intercourse, but I didn't really look while we were doing it kind of fantasies. So when somebody evokes this fantasy that women sometimes report and call it a rape fantasy, they're not talking about anything close to what we're talking about with rape. We're not talking about losing the ability to say no and the rapist can do whatever they want. It's a fantasy where they're so desirable, and it's a different thing. Women don't secretly want to be raped. Women don't need to be forced into sexual responding. Women don't say no just to get men to try harder. So those are all myths. Now, I thought this Dolce & Gabbana ad was a very interesting take on the female, desirability fantasy. When I show this in class, the picture is so big, it's really creepy looking when you look at it really big on the screen in class, because it's hard to see what message they could possibly be trying to send. I mean, these four men are looking at her like she's, I don't know, lunch almost. I use this illustration as my idea of, she may have a fantasy that all these men find her so attractive, but you'll notice nobody's forced her to the ground and held her arms above her head, and I mean, it's like nothing's happening that's anything like a rape, even if we look at this kind of creepy looking picture. And that's the content of women's fantasies, is a lot of times it's just about being desirable. All right, let's go ahead and take a little break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the myth that women can resist a super intent rapist.